It all started like a small, almost harmless change in the weather. A whisper of wind you barely notice until the trees begin to sway. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. She smiled too brightly at a joke, remembered the exact words of a story I told months ago, and always knew just when to show up with a coffee or a sympathetic ear. Those things felt like gifts. They felt like care. So when little things didn't add up, I shrugged them away. A story told one way today and another way tomorrow. A promised favor that never came through. An unexplained excuse. Tiny inconsistencies that could be explained away as tiredness, or stress, or the fog of everyday life. I wanted to believe the best of her. It's easier to live in that truth. But there was a slow nagging hum under everything. A feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was off. It was the kind of unease that shows itself in small ways. A skipped heartbeat when a text went unanswered, the way my voice wavered when I asked a simple question, the absurd little rehearsals I did in my head before meeting her, just to see how she'd respond. I called it paranoia. I called it sensitivity. I called it whatever made me feel less foolish. She had perfected an art. She wore warmth like a coat, effortless, flattering, the kind that made people lean in and trust. At parties she floated through rooms, touching shoulders, offering laughing support, and leaving behind the sort of hush that people call admiration. She would remember birthdays, forgive mistakes, make you feel as if you were the center of her universe. Her perfection wasn't loud, it was practiced. It slid into conversation so naturally that you never questioned it. And because she was so believable, I let her in. I shared things I shouldn't have with people I shouldn't have trusted. I let my guard down because it felt safe. It's always the ones who seem kindest that you let close. You assume they'll hold your secrets gently. The day everything changed was not dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no cinematic betrayal. It was ordinary. A Thursday gray light coming through the window, the kettle humming in the kitchen. I was doing something small and practical when a thread of detail snagged in my mind. A word she had used last week, a mention of a person I'd never met, a fact that contradicted something she'd told me months before. It was tiny. Tiny was all it took. I followed that thread like anyone curious would, because curiosity doesn't start as a weapon. Starts as a question. So I asked another question. Then another. I checked my messages, lined up conversations in my head, and the more I looked, the less everything fit. Pieces that had been shaped to fit together no longer did. Her stories, her promises, her warmth. It all began to show thin seams where someone else might have stitched it together. Something colder began to rise in my chest, the recognition that she had been constructing a version of herself for others to see. The kindness had been real in a way but curated. It was performance and protection, skillfully wielded to keep people close and doubts at bay. And somewhere in that construction, she had decided she could shape the truth to suit her. She had decided that being believed was more important than being honest. The sting of betrayal arrived quietly but fully. It wasn't the shock of discovery as much as the slow dawning. Not only had she lied, she had believed I would never notice. The worst part wasn't the untruths. It was what the untruths implied. She assumed my silence. She assumed complacency. She assumed I would be easy to manage. Another piece in the carefully arranged story she told the world. I remember the exact sound of my own breath that afternoon, small, controlled, as though I were practicing steadiness. My heart thudded in my throat for a moment before settling into a steady, cold rhythm. There was an electric pinprick of anger, bright and sharp. It wasn't the raw, hot fury that makes people lash out. It was a precise, clinical clarity. Something had been taken from me. Not a thing, but my sense of reality with someone I had trusted. That loss demanded an answer. For a while I teetered on two impulses. One wanted to confront her immediately, to call her out in the moment, to tear the mask off and demand the truth raw and naked. I pictured the confrontation in my head more times than I care to admit. The words I would say, the way her face would change, the possible victory in forcing a confession. That fantasy felt good in a small childish way. It felt like justice delivered in a single dramatic moment. But I knew her better than that. She fed on drama. When you give her chaos, she thrives. She could turn rage into sympathy, that's what she did. She turned the person willing to stand up into the person everyone else pitied. She would weave the story that made her the victim, and I would be the foolish one who overreacted. She wanted me to crumble publicly, to hand her power back with a cry. I refused to give her that triumph. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I waited. I put the fire of my immediate reaction into a locked box and set it on a shelf. I told myself to breathe and to watch. That restraint became my first act of power. There is strength in not being the predictable response someone expects. There is a power in observation. Observation is a quiet, steady work. It doesn't glow or make headlines. It asks for patience and attention to small things that others call insignificant. I began to catalog the inconsistencies, not in a journalistic frenzy but like someone mapping a terrain before a journey. I paid attention to tone, to timing, to the little patterns that repeated. I listened to how she deflected questions and who she avoided. I noted the names she never mentioned and the ones she praised too loudly. Each small item was a tile. I wasn't yet building an accusation. I was building a picture. There were days I felt ashamed of my caution, like a coward watching from the shadows. There were nights when the quiet made the betrayal echo louder than it had during the day. But each time doubt crept in. What if you're wrong? I reminded myself that proving the truth carefully would not only spare me humiliation, it would spare me the kind of rashness that feeds manipulators. As the days became weeks, something else shifted inside me. My initial hurt softened into something else. A plan, yes, but also a resolve to protect myself, and to make sure she couldn't hurt others the way she had hurt me. That transformation felt strange, like stepping into a different skin. It wasn't about becoming hard or cruel. It was about becoming precise. It was about taking control of the narrative that she had assumed she controlled. I started imagining what exposing her might look like. Not the mean, impulsive kind of exposure that seeks only to wound, but one that revealed facts, made things clear, and left no room for her to deny. I pictured evidence laid out calmly, truth presented like light in a dark room. I imagined people looking, really looking, and not walking away with a comforting lie because they wanted things tidy. The plan would require patience. It would require me to learn to read people the way she had learned to read me. It would require cunning of a kind I never thought I possessed. But the most important thing it required was conviction. A belief that my voice mattered, that my experience was valid, and that silence would not be my only option. So I began to prepare. I watched. I listened. I collected. Not out of spite but out of necessity. The moment she thought I'd stay quiet, that moment of arrogance, would be the moment she realized she had underestimated me. And when that moment came, I wanted to be ready. To the world, she was flawless. Flawless in a way that made you feel small just by being near her. Flawless in the way she moved through life as if it had been scripted for her alone. At work, she was the one people sought for advice, the voice of calm in a storm of confusion. At parties, she was radiant, effortlessly the center of attention without seeming to try. Even among friends, she was the anchor, the comforting presence who always seemed to know the right thing to say. I had admired her once, maybe too much, for her ability to hold herself together, for the charm that made her seem untouchable. But admiration can be blind. And now with the veil lifted, I saw her for what she truly was, a mask. Every gesture, every smile, every word carefully weighed and placed to create the illusion of perfection. It was subtle, almost invisible at first. But as I observed her more closely, the patterns began to emerge. Her attention was selective, her kindness measured, her interest carefully curated. She laughed when it suited her, sympathized when it advanced her image, and erased any trace of doubt before anyone noticed it existed. Her perfection wasn't accidental. It was crafted, refined over time until she believed it could never be pierced. That's when I saw my opportunity. The mask she wore was beautiful, yes, but it was fragile. Every mask, no matter how perfect, has seams. I started noticing them. The way her eyes flickered when a certain topic came up, the way her smile wavered ever so slightly when she was caught off guard, the small inconsistencies in stories she told more than once. I began keeping notes, little observations that, to anyone else, would seem trivial. A hesitation here, a glance there, the names she never spoke of, the people she dismissed too quickly. These were the invisible cracks in her armor, invisible to all but the patient and the attentive. And patience had now become my closest ally. With each crack I discovered, my resolve grew stronger. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Revenge was small, reactive, temporary. What I wanted was justice. I wanted her to understand that manipulation has consequences, that the truth cannot be hidden forever, and that no one is invincible. But I had to tread carefully. She was perceptive, cunning, and always 2 steps ahead. One misstep on my part, one careless look or poorly timed question, and she would retreat further behind her mask, tighten it, add another layer of lies to protect herself. Patience became not just a tool but a necessity. I began to watch her interactions more closely than ever. The way she spoke to different people revealed patterns. The way she avoided certain questions hinted at secrets. Even the smallest gestures, a shrug, a delayed response, a fleeting eye roll, began to tell a story of their own. And slowly, like pieces of a puzzle, the truth started to form. I realized that exposing her wouldn't be easy. It would require timing, precision, and the ability to remain unseen while she continued to believe she was untouchable. But the thought of finally revealing the truth, of showing her that her mask could be torn away, was exhilarating. Every day I learned more, watched more, and became more certain that her confidence in my silence would be her greatest mistake. The mask she wore was dazzling, but it was built on lies and careful control, and I had discovered the cracks. Each crack was a promise that the moment of exposure was drawing nearer. Patience, I reminded myself, was my greatest weapon. It was a quiet afternoon, nothing remarkable about the day itself. The sun filtered softly through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the room. I remember the hum of distant traffic, the faint ticking of the wall clock, ordinary sounds, nothing that would hint at the storm about to hit. She was talking to me about something trivial, almost meaningless. A story about a coworker, a casual complaint about a delayed order, some joke about a mutual friend. She laughed freely, the sound light and effortless, as if we were the closest of confidants. I smiled along, nodding at the right moments, making it clear I was engaged, unthreatening. And then it happened. A slip. So small that anyone else might have missed it, brushed off as nothing. But my heart leapt in that moment because I knew she had revealed something, a detail she had never meant to share, a fragment of truth hidden in her polished facade. I felt my pulse quicken. The sensation was thrilling, almost electric. This was the turning point. This was the moment when suspicion became certainty, when my quiet observations and careful patience began to coalesce into undeniable truth. I did not react. I didn't flinch, I didn't ask questions, I didn't give her even the slightest hint that I had caught her. On the outside, I appeared calm, friendly, uninterested in anything but the trivial chatter. Inside, though, my mind raced at lightning speed. I replayed her words, examined the slip from every angle, and began connecting it to the months of subtle manipulations I had witnessed. Piece by piece, the puzzle started to come together. The inconsistencies that had niggled at me, the small cracks in her mask I had catalogued, the moments of avoidance, hesitation, and misdirection, all began to fit into a single coherent pattern. I realized with a shock that she had assumed I would stay silent. She had believed her carefully constructed world, the lies she told, the truth she buried, the people she deceived, would remain unchallenged. She had believed her perfection was untouchable, her charm unassailable. And she was wrong. A strange calm washed over me alongside a surge of determination. The scales had fallen from my eyes, and for the first time, I saw her exactly as she was. Meticulous, cunning, and dangerously arrogant. Her overconfidence was her weakness, and I now held the key to unraveling it. I didn't speak. I didn't confront. I didn't let her sense even a fraction of the storm building inside me. Instead, I filed the moment away like a secret weapon. It would become a cornerstone of my plan, the undeniable proof that her carefully cultivated image was not as flawless as she believed. From that moment on, everything changed. My observations gained sharper focus, my patience became strategy, and my resolve hardened into action, silent, measured, inevitable. I had crossed a line from suspicion into certainty, and there was no turning back. I knew with absolute certainty that confronting her directly would accomplish nothing. She was clever in the way predators are clever, quick, manipulative, and practiced. She would twist my words, bend the truth, and somehow make it look like I was overreacting, unstable, or paranoid. Confrontation would hand her control, give her the upper hand. No, I needed something far more precise, a plan that was undeniable, airtight, and when the time came, completely shocking. The first step was observation. I became a shadow in my own life, watching closely, silently, collecting details that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. I watched how she moved through her day, the subtle gestures she thought went unnoticed, the way she dodged certain questions, and how she laughed a little too quickly at convenient stories. I paid attention to who she confided in, who she dismissed, and who she subtly manipulated to do her bidding without anyone realizing it. I noted inconsistencies in her stories, patterns of deflection, the tiny cracks she tried desperately to conceal. Every whispered detail, every casual comment became a piece of the puzzle she had thought was invisible. And with each new observation, my understanding of her world deepened. Then came the part that thrilled me, the strategy. Planning the exposure wasn't about anger anymore. It was about timing. Too soon and she would recover, rebuild her mask, and laugh off my accusations. Too late and the moment would lose its impact. I needed the exact balance, a moment where the truth would land like a lightning strike. Sudden, undeniable, and irreversible. I imagined the reveal over and over. Her expression, initially smug and self-assured, slowly twisting into shock and disbelief. The rapid flutter of questions crossing her mind as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The panic behind her eyes as she realized she could no longer control the narrative. And with every rehearsal in my mind, my determination grew, fueled by a mix of adrenaline, satisfaction, and the quiet justice I was about to deliver. Every detail of the plan was deliberate. I would gather undeniable evidence, piece together the inconsistencies she had tried to hide, and ensure witnesses who could corroborate the truth were in place. Everything had to be foolproof. No room for her to manipulate, no cracks for her to hide behind. Even in the quiet moments I would rehearse the plan. I imagined her scrambling, desperately trying to explain herself, trying to rewrite the story she had spun for so long. I imagined the relief of those who had been deceived, finally seeing the truth. I imagined the sense of calm and control settling over me as the chaos I had quietly orchestrated unfolded perfectly. Patience became my ally, precision my shield, and strategy my weapon. I wasn't seeking revenge in a fiery, chaotic sense. I was seeking clarity, justice, and the undeniable exposure of her lies. She had believed she was untouchable. She had assumed I would stay quiet. That assumption, that arrogance, would be her undoing. Over the next few weeks I began to make my moves quiet, careful, almost imperceptible. Nothing that would alert her, nothing that would hint at what I was truly planning. Each step was measured, deliberate, a tiny ripple in her carefully controlled world. I started by planting subtle hints, casual remarks in conversation that seemed ordinary, almost innocent. A comment here, a question there, designed to see how she would respond, to test the limits of her composure. Would she slip? Would her reaction reveal the truth she worked so hard to conceal? I watched her closely. When certain topics arose, I saw the brief flinch in her posture, the rapid blink, the micro-expression that betrayed the confidence she tried so hard to project. I noticed the way her smile faltered for a split second when she believed no one was watching. Those tiny cracks became my guideposts, telling me that the plan was working, that she was as human as anyone else beneath the mask. I began documenting everything meticulously. Every message, every seemingly innocent conversation, every fleeting action that contradicted her story was recorded. I built a catalog of evidence, a quiet accumulation of proof that, when needed, would leave her no room to deny the truth. Even things that seemed trivial at the time, a misstatement, an omitted detail, a hesitant gesture, were carefully noted. Nothing escaped my attention. Each day the plan became clearer. The outline of the final reveal began to take shape in my mind like a blueprint. Every small detail added depth. Every subtle reaction sharpened my understanding. And yet, she remained oblivious, confident, almost smug in the belief that I would never act. She had no idea that I was quietly assembling the pieces that would eventually dismantle her world. That belief, her arrogance, was her greatest mistake. She thought her mask was flawless, her lies untouchable, and that I would remain silent. But with every careful observation, every subtle nudge, every documented detail, I was preparing the moment when her world would shift completely. Patience became not just a tactic but a weapon. Every subtle move I made was a silent strike, a way of setting the stage for the moment she would realize how wrong she had been. And as I continued, I felt the quiet satisfaction of progress, invisible, patient, inevitable. As the days passed, the tension became almost tangible, like the charged air before a storm. Every interaction with her felt like walking a tightrope stretched high above a chasm. One wrong word, one poorly timed glance, and the entire delicate balance could collapse before I was ready. I had to be careful, patient, invisible in my vigilance, and yet that very tension fueled me. There was something intoxicating about it, the way suspense can sharpen your senses and focus your mind. I noticed the smallest details, the way her hand trembled when a certain topic came up, the subtle hesitation before she answered a seemingly simple question, the way her eyes darted ever so slightly when she thought no one was looking. Every micro-movement, every tiny crack in her performance became a signpost, a guide to when the perfect moment would arrive. But the tension wasn't just about her. It forced me to reflect on myself. Why had I allowed her to deceive me for so long? Part of me burned with anger, furious at the audacity of her lies, the ease with which she had manipulated my trust. And yet, beneath that anger, there was a strange sense of gratitude. This experience had taught me invaluable lessons. The power of patience, the necessity of strategy, and the unshakable importance of knowing my own worth. I reminded myself that haste was my enemy. Acting too soon would ruin everything, and I could not afford to hand her victory in my eagerness. Every moment I waited was a moment she remained unsuspecting, confident, and therefore more vulnerable when the truth finally came. I began to embrace the tension, seeing it not as a source of stress, but as a tool, a quiet energy that could be channeled into focus, precision, and control. Every meeting became more than just conversation, it was reconnaissance. Every social interaction was a test. I asked questions not to probe blindly, but to observe, to catch the faintest flicker of discomfort. Each laugh, each pause, each carefully phrased sentence was noted mentally, a small piece of the larger picture I was assembling. In those moments I became almost invisible. People would see me and think I was engaged casually, but I was absorbing everything, filing it away for the right time. And all the while the anticipation grew. The closer we came to the moment of revelation, the more vivid the plan became in my mind. I began to savor the suspense. The waiting, the careful observation, the quiet tension. It was a prelude to the ultimate moment when everything would change. I knew the day would come when her mask would slip entirely, when her arrogance would crash against the truth I had so patiently gathered. And when that day came, there would be no escape, no excuses, no manipulation strong enough to defend her. So I waited, patient, calm, steady, letting the tension build, letting her grow more confident with each passing day, all while preparing for the moment that would finally tip the scales. Before the final reveal, I knew I needed smaller victories, moments that would slowly erode her perfect image before the truth came crashing down. Big exposures are powerful, yes, but they're only effective when the foundation is already cracking. So, I began with the small things, quiet strategic moves that would make people start to doubt her, even without realizing why. I started casually, in conversations that seemed harmless. A passing remark here, a subtle question there. I'd bring up inconsistencies in her stories as if I were confused, pretending to seek clarification rather than planting suspicion. Didn't she say something different last week? Or that's strange. I thought she mentioned something else before. Simple, innocent phrases, but to the right ears they worked like whispers that grew louder over time. People began to notice. Slowly, they started piecing together the tiny cracks I had already seen. Her once perfect image began to wobble, ever so slightly. The same friends who once praised her started to pause before speaking her name. Some began to exchange uncertain glances when she entered the room. Others grew cautious, less trusting, as if sensing that something about her didn't quite add up anymore. And watching it unfold was intoxicating. Not because I wanted to see her destroyed for the sake of it, but because for the first time I could see justice in motion, quiet, subtle, elegant. I didn't need to shout or accuse. The truth was beginning to do the work for me. She sensed it too. I could see it in her eyes, that flicker of unease when people didn't greet her with the same warmth as before. Her once effortless smile began to tighten around the edges. There was a nervousness in her laugh, a slight hesitation in her tone. The control she had so carefully maintained was beginning to slip, and she could feel it. But the best part? She didn't know who was behind it. She couldn't pinpoint where the unease had started, or who had begun asking the quiet questions. Her paranoia became her undoing. She started second-guessing everyone around her, spinning in circles trying to find the source of the whispers. And in doing so, she began to expose herself even more. I stayed calm, invisible, blending into the background. I was careful not to overplay my hand. The goal wasn't to destroy her reputation overnight. It was to weaken her confidence, to make her desperate enough to make mistakes. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own lies pressing down, forcing cracks to form from the inside out. It worked beautifully. She began to overcompensate, trying too hard to prove she was still in control. She would talk more, explain more, justify things no one had even questioned yet. And with every unnecessary explanation, she revealed more than she intended. The small exposures were doing their job. They were the tremors before the earthquake, the signs that the structure was already faltering. I could feel the momentum shifting. The balance of power was changing, and she didn't even know it yet. And that was the sweetest part of all. Watching her struggle to hold her mask in place, not realizing that it was already cracking beyond repair. Everything had to be perfect. After weeks of careful watching and small deliberate moves, the last thing I wanted was for the moment to be diluted by a slip or a misstep. This wasn't about theatrics, it was about clarity. I wanted the truth to land so cleanly that there was nowhere for her to hide, nowhere for excuses to take root. So I planned every detail like someone staging a play where the only acceptable ending was the one I'd written. I chose the place with intention. Not a courtroom, not a confrontational public square, but a room where people felt comfortable and safe, somewhere her mask had been most at ease. Familiar surroundings would make the contrast sharper. The ordinary setting would make the revelation feel impossible and undeniable. I picked a neutral space, bright enough to see every expression, quiet enough that whispers would travel and questions would be heard. Timing mattered as much as location. I waited for a moment when enough of the right people would be there, witnesses whose words carried weight, friends who once trusted her implicitly, people whose disbelief would become the clearest proof of her deception once they saw the facts. I wanted those reactions not out of cruelty, but because the truth shared by trusted voices is what dismantles lies most effectively. I gathered the proof methodically. Messages, dates, inconsistencies cross-referenced and time-stamped. Small recordings, not invasive, only what had been shared willingly in conversations, and documents that mapped her stories against reality. I organized everything so that each piece fit into a sequence, a narrative that would be impossible to reinterpret. I made backups. I rehearsed the order in which I would present each item, the pauses I would take, the questions I would ask that would invite confirmation rather than argument. There were contingencies for her gaslighting, prepared witnesses to corroborate timelines, screenshots to counter edited explanations, and a calm, firm script I would follow to avoid emotional hijacking. I practiced my words until they felt natural, not rehearsed, clear, measured, and precise. I knew that anger would only give her a weapon. Calm would strip her of any sympathetic rewrite she might try to craft. When the day came, I felt a curious mixture of anticipation and serenity. Inside, my chest hummed with a focused energy. Outside, my face was tranquil. I arrived early, set the pieces in order, and watched as familiar faces drifted in, some unaware, some expecting nothing more than a casual catch-up. I felt the room's air tighten with the same charged quiet I'd felt before storms. That tension was not a threat anymore. It was the signal that the moment was near. I took one last breath and reminded myself why I had chosen this path. Not out of spite, but because truth demanded to be known. I sat down, opened a folder, and let my fingers rest on the first document. The culmination of weeks of patience and precision sat between us, waiting to be unfolded. When the moment finally came, the rush was unlike anything I'd ever felt. My pulse thundered in my chest, but my expression remained composed. This wasn't a scene for chaos or shouting. It was a moment for precision, for truth delivered so cleanly that it could never be twisted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand anyone's attention. Instead, I let the truth speak for itself. Calmly, I laid out the evidence I had gathered, piece by piece, word by word, each revelation building upon the last like a rising tide. I spoke evenly, clearly, without accusation, only with the weight of undeniable facts. At first she laughed, a fragile, uncertain sound meant to deflect the growing tension. But as each proof landed, her laughter faded. Her eyes flicked from face to face, searching for someone to believe her, to rescue her. None came. The walls of her deception were collapsing, and she could feel every crack forming in real time. Shock. Disbelief. Then slowly realization. The color drained from her face as the truth settled in. The mask she had worn for so long, that polished, perfect image she built and guarded, shattered before my eyes. What was left wasn't the confident, untouchable person everyone thought they knew, but someone frightened, exposed, and desperately scrambling for control. And for the first time I saw her vulnerability, the panic behind her eyes, the silence that followed her failed explanations. Every word she tried to utter tangled itself into contradictions. She had believed I would stay quiet, that I would let her lies go unchallenged. But now she understood. I had been waiting for this moment, and I had shocked her instead. The room fell utterly still. Eyes widened. Whispers began to ripple across the space like waves breaking in slow motion. People exchanged glances, disbelief etched on their faces. The truth was sinking in, and there was no undoing it. She looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Gone was her arrogance, her certainty. All that remained was the awareness that her own actions had led her here. That every lie, every manipulation, every calculated move had brought her to this inevitable point. And I stood there calm, collected, and strangely serene. Not gloating, not cruel, just steady, centered, resolved. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. About balance being restored. I felt no need to say anything more. The evidence spoke louder than any argument could. Her silence, and the silence that filled the room, said everything. I had done what she never expected. I stayed patient, I stayed quiet until it mattered most. And when I finally spoke, I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth itself did all the shouting.